Let's go ahead and get the ball rolling as more people join us. So welcome everyone to our webinar today on what to know about RIFs, relocation, and reassignment. My name is Kevin Johnson. I'm a director here at the Partnership of Public Service on our workforce programs team. I'm joined by my colleague, Mary Monty, who is supporting the production of this webinar. For those who are not familiar with us, the partnership, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization working to build a better government and a stronger democracy through policy advocacy, leadership development, workforce programming, and convening leaders across organizations and sectors. The most tangible impact seen through our support for the federal workforce might be delivering webinars like this one, sharing resources, providing plain language explainers, and amplifying the stories of the incredible work that federal employees do for our country every single day. For the pheasants who are in attendance, please thank you for your service and your continuous dedication to making sure that we live in a great country. I want to share a few notes before digging into today's conversation. These are just context for you all to understand the purpose of these webinars, as well as what information you should be really pulling from the comments and insights of our great experts that we have joining us today. So throughout the webinar, we will answer questions that you submitted during registration. You can also submit a question anonymously through the Q&A function, and we will do our best to address the common themes and questions as we go along. Given the complexity and nuances of the topics that we discuss, we may not be able to address every single question or the associated circumstances that come up today, but please know that you can continue to find information on our FedSupport website. That hub is a great resource for not only finding the recordings of these sessions, but also contains critical information to support the federal workforce amid today's changing government landscape. With that, you will see the link to our hub in the chat. And then with that, to ensure that panelists and I can tailor this webinar to the needs of the feds in the room, we have an anonymous 2-question poll for you all to fill out. The first question asks if you've already received a RIF notice. And the second question, which is optional, asks which agency you've been most recently employed. Again, these polls questions are anonymous, and there will be no attribution if you choose to share this information. So I'll give you all about a minute to fill out that poll, and then we'll utilize that information as we go forward to prioritize questions. Again, you should see a pop-up window on your screen. Give you another 30 seconds to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to respond. All right, Mary, you can go ahead and close the poll. All right, and just a final housekeeping before we get started here. So while this discussion is geared for federal employees, it is an open forum and may have folks joining us from different communities, different organizations outside of the federal government space. Considering the deep expertise of our panelists, their recommendations and interpretation of laws and policies may not align with everyone's agency or individual circumstances. Consequently, we do encourage you to reach out to your HR and general counsel departments for guidance specific to your agency. In addition, several law firms and communities of attorneys are offering pro bono services to feds as you navigate major career decisions. So do please keep that in mind. This session is meant to be just one component of the information that you're taking in to make a decision about your career, as well as the things that impact your life. With all that in mind, I'd like to introduce our panelists who are joining us tonight to help us answer these questions. So Nick and Traci, could you all please briefly introduce yourselves? So let's start with Nick, and then we'll transition over to Traci.
Yeah, so my name's Nick Bednar. I'm a professor of law and political science at the University of Minnesota Law School. And most of my research focuses on the federal workforce and the relationship between the president and the federal workforce.
And I'm Traci DiMartini. I'm still a proud civil servant, even though I was doged on March 3rd, 2025. So I was the proud IRS Chief Human Capital Officer. And before that, I was privileged to be the GSA's Chief Human Capital Officer. I'm really excited to be here with Kevin and Nick to just provide a general framework and hopefully provide a little bit of consolation to everyone because we agree as a team, and we know all of you probably agree. One of the hardest things that's happened the past 5 months is the lack of transparency and direct information. So, to the extent Nick will be providing absolutely coherent, legal based, structural questions, I have promised the partnership to keep my witty commentary to a minimum. But because so many of you kind folks have joined us tonight, I'll throw in a zinger or two when Kevin's not paying attention.
I'll make sure to turn my head and give you a wink.
There you go.
So before I ask my first question, as a final reminder, the goal of today's webinar is to help you better understand the choices available to you when it comes to RIFs, reassignments, or relocations, plus provide insights into how the administration and agencies are currently approaching these policies. So again, please submit your questions in the Q&A function, and myself and Mary to make sure to track those as we go along. So my first question is to both of you all. We'll start with Traci and then flip it over to Nick. Let's talk about what people really want to know is what are the top 3 things federal employees can do right now to prepare themselves in advance of RIFs or relocations?
That is a fabulous question, Kevin. First off, I do want to also give a little special to anyone that's on the line from IRS or GSA. I love following your threads and keep up the great work you both agencies are doing. Here's what you guys need to do. If you have not already, you need to make sure you are downloading a full copy of your electronic personnel file. Get it. You can download it on your work computer and print a hard copy for yourself. Take that hard copy home. You need to, if you need instructions or help, I'm sure your agency has a ticketing system to ask HR for help. The second thing you need to do is have a little bit, actually, no, a lot of patience and grace for your HR offices right now. Yes, their lives have also been hell since January 20th. But the one thing that's important to remember is a lot of what Nick and I are going to discuss about preparations for a reduction in force and other parts of civil service law is agencies, HR offices have been notoriously underfunded and understaffed for at least a decade, probably in some agencies longer than that. So a lot of what Nick and I are going to talk about, the agencies, frankly, have not had the resources to be positioned for the kind of data and service record review that is necessary. So while you do need guidance and you should be receiving guidance and great customer service from your HR teams, they are under enormous stress because a lot of their teams also took the deferred resignation or VERA or VSIP. The third thing is if you have not joined your local union, your local Federal Management Association or Senior Executive Service, SEA, do it. Those entities are another way to get incredibly rich amounts of information that is correct and based in legal sufficiency, and they have the expertise of tons of attorneys that know and live and breathe civil service law. Do not get yourself wound up over what you hear through the grapevine or from your friend in another agency, because as Kevin said, every agency is approaching this differently. And so you have to be very mindful. And I guess I'm going to lie, Kevin, I'm going to add a fourth. In addition to your electronic personnel file, document, document. Every RIF notice you receive, every conversation that is had, make sure you're doing at least a memo for your records, because should you decide to take action in the future or should you be asked for that information, you've maintained a record for yourselves. And that is what is important, because right now it's been very easy to whip people up into a frenzy over a lot of misinformation. We don't have time for that. You have to become better informed and better armed with the facts. And we'll get more into why that matters when we go through the discussion. Nick, over to you.
Yeah, so I'm going to echo a lot of what Traci said, which is one, document, and download that official personnel folder. If you end up taking action, one of the first things the attorney is going to ask you for is any RIF notice you received, any communications you've had with the agency regarding that, and your personnel folder, because part of the deal with the RIF and the way to challenge it is based on the order of retention, which is going to come through in that personnel file. So your attorney is going to want to make sure that everything in that personnel file is both accurate and wherever you're placed in that order of retention is accurate in that based on what's in that folder. Likewise, if you notice an error in your personnel folder, yes, the HR departments are very slow. They're very underfunded right now, but submit a ticket as soon as possible to get that corrected because you do not want to be in the position of having to correct it once the 60-day notice comes through. You want it corrected beforehand so you can maybe avoid some of the headache. Second, I think, you're all taking the first step here, which is educate yourself about what the RIF procedures actually require. One important thing to know is the federal government does have a right to reorganize its workforce. There is a process, but they have to follow that process. And to the extent you have some basic knowledge about what that process looks like, it can really help you understand what the next steps are going to be and where you need to be at. Final thing I'll say is I recommend getting together a plan in case you are RIFed, particularly if you are in an agency where we're seeing a lot of personnel action being taken place. Some things to know, you can request your retention standing from the HR department. If you are RIFed, you should do so immediately. Often you can file for state unemployment benefits. You should know how to file for state unemployment benefits. You may be eligible for SNAP. You may be eligible for Medicaid. And it's important to know if you are going to take action, you only have 30 days to file with the Merit Systems Protection Board. And so having that plan in place of, okay, what am I doing on day one? What do I need to do in the first week is going to be really important to preserve your rights.
Yeah, and then Traci, can you share like some of the recourse federal workers have when faced with involuntary separation or relocation?
Sure. So let me start at the top with, you heard Nick and I both allude to the fact that this civil service law, and Nick's really good at he'll lay out the regulations and the process. I'm going to talk about the HR piece so we can have a good meeting of the minds. So there is Title V of of federal regulations does tell you how to run a RIF. It spells it out, and then OPM has also articulated it. And then beyond that, agencies have this embedded in their labor contracts, or I should say every agency I have worked at. Now, we can have a whole other side discussion later in this call about what happens when you have an administration that is absolutely throwing out the law of a union contract, or the promising regulations between the agency and the union. But it's important to understand that a real, well-intentioned, well thought out, strategized reduction in force takes anywhere from 12 to 18 months to conduct. First, you have the pre-RIF planning period. That is when you should be giving notice that there's basically a study underway to look at the need to run a possible RIF. And there's a lot of components that go in there. One of them we already talked about. HR is then going to start making sure personnel records are in order. You may, again, this is not just about, oh, let's take a crap on HR, they stink. We can debate that at another time. The bottom line is we just went to fully electronic personnel records within the past 7 to 10 years. I know at IRS, we never had the funding, and we were not able to achieve that goal until 2024. And the second part of that is our agencies utilizing it, and our agencies also making sure the information is transmitted in a timely manner. Here's when it's also incumbent for an employee to understand your service record is your responsibility. So if you do transfer agencies, and every time you have a par cut for you, you should be checking that, not just deleting the notice when it comes in your email that something was added to your personnel file, making sure it's correct. Just like we tell everyone to do for their earnings and leave statements, you need to make sure, is the service record correct? So doing that hygienic 1-year review is critical. It needs to be even more frequent during a possible RIF. Another reason why this is important, some of you, if your agency requests it, and they should be doing that before conducting a RIF, if they have the ability to do a VERA, the Voluntary Early Retirement Authority, you need to make sure your records are in order for when you submit your retirement paperwork. So I cannot underscore enough, all of you that have not yet done so need to go and download your personnel file and start doing that review. After that whole RIF planning process, which I should say top of the line is the agency has to articulate the need for a RIF. Is it because they have identified there are a lot of positions that are redundant or similar in nature? And I'll give you one example that I think everyone can understand. A lot of times agencies have tried to move to a centralized way of doing business functions, whether it be budget or procurement or HR, some places even facilities. And most offices want to have their own administrative staff there. And sometimes that gets to be too many people trying to do similar work. So for the example with HR, in order to do the whole suite of duties responsible for an HR specialist in federal service, you're classified as a 201. There are things that you can do on behalf of the agency, such as if you pass the test for delegated examining unit or being steeped in the knowledge that you need to do workforce analysis or having oversight over payroll. Some agencies also have 301s or 343s doing what we call the shadow work that maybe have HR in their title or IT in their title, but they are not doing the full suite of work that is inherent to that series. So that would be an example of something that's considered redundant work. It happens in every agency. It's very common. It's just one of those gut checks that the agency needs to do to make sure it's at appropriate size and maximum efficiency. And we'll also look at things such as your grade structure. The last 10 years, because we have not had stable wage growth in the federal service, the wage structure is out of whack. There are too many non-supervisory 14s and 15s. And that's okay. You can challenge me on it because I haven't been in the office in 3 months. So good luck finding me. Seriously, you guys need to understand this is a big deal. Agencies need to maximize the dollars they have coming to them. And that should mean having a structure that looks like this, which is a very thin upper layer of management and more people being able to do the work. Then there goes into the implementation of the RIF, which again takes up to 12 months because there are lots of notification times built in, not just with your union partners, but in some instances, there must be congressional notification that a reduction in force is taking place because that does impact not only what the agency's bottom line is from their appropriations, they may need to ask for more money to do supplemental monetary outlays, such as severance pay or major leave payouts. I think it'll be interesting to look at in 2025 what the bottom line is at the end of this calendar year. The federal government's going to be paying out unprecedented amounts of money to individuals that are retiring effective September 30th or have their deferred resignation ending. There will be lots of large leave balances that will be coming due because the agencies typically have to pay that out within 30 days or 2 pay periods. Is that what it equates to? And let's not even get into the way that we calculate how all of this extra work reduces efficiencies and performance in other areas and what those return on investment outcomes may eventually look like. And we may not actually see that till 27 or 28, depending on how many studies are asked for and if there's ever an agreed upon methodology. But I'm sure Nick also can weigh in on some of those very cool, and he's got them all stored up here, those federal citations on the process.
Yes. For Nick, can you Traci touched on some of them before, and then you touched on one before. Can you talk more about the 30-day, 60-day notifications? Because there are some questions about if those notification time periods are still valid, given the changes within OPM, the Federal Labor Relations Authority, and other agencies that kind of oversee some of those regulations. So can you share more insights into that?
Yeah. So, okay. So I'm going to kind of pick up where Traci left off, and I'll get to how this notice all kind of fits in. So Traci talked nicely about how a RIF gets prepared within the HR office and what it takes for the agency to perform a RIF and why RIFs are often performed. Set aside why RIFs are being performed today, which maybe isn't wholly why we think they should be performed generally, but you are entitled to a 60-day notice under most circumstances for a reduction in force. That notice has to provide certain information for you, and upon receiving that notice, you are entitled to the retention register to figure out where you are for purposes of reassignment rights. There is a provision in the code that permits OPM to authorize a 30-day notice instead, which some agencies have been granted. It's not entirely clear to me which agencies. Part of the problem with this conversation, Traci and I have to give a very broad overview because so much stuff is happening in very different ways at very different agencies. It's hard to speak to very particular circumstances. But generally, the RIF notice is 60 days. We've seen a lot of agencies continuing to apply with the 60 days. I assume people are asking if it's valid because FLRA and MSPB currently do not have quorums. It remains the case that if you intend to challenge your RIF, you have 30 days to file regardless of that quorum. So
Right.
do not think because there is no one capable of deciding an appeal at the Merit Systems Protection Board that you are off the hook in filing. That deadline is still going to apply to you. So you have 30 days to challenge a RIF once you get it. Why might you challenge a RIF? Well, there are two big reasons. There are a bunch of reasons, but two big ones. The first is that something in the order of retention is wrong. In other words, they calculated where you should be in that order of retention inaccurately. One reason we've seen that happen recently was Health and Human Services used the wrong performance records for every single employee, to the best of my knowledge. And so all of those order of retentions are incorrect and could be challenged. The other reason you might end up challenging a RIF, which I think Traci might talk about a bit later, is reassignment. So there is a position that you believe you are qualified for, that the individual who currently holds it is lower than you in the competitive level, and you would otherwise fill that position based on your rank. Those are the two main reasons we see RIFs challenged. You can challenge the agency's reasoning for a RIF. It is very, very rare that the Merit Systems Protection Board chooses to override the agency's reasoning. Typically, so long as the agency has offered a bona fide reason for needing a RIF, that is going to stand, and then the question is whether it is procedurally accurate. So once you have filed with the Merit Systems Protection Board, you will go before an administrative law judge. The administrative law judges right now are not affected by the lack of a quorum at the Merit Systems Protection Board, and you'll get an initial decision from the administrative law judge. Either you or the government then has an opportunity to appeal to the Merit Systems Protection Board, that three-person panel who hears appeals. This is the point at which your case is likely to get stuck because although, so for lack, I'm not going to get into like really complicated legal procedure of all of this. You're likely to get stuck at that point if they don't have a quorum.
Yep.
You cannot easily move to federal court because the federal circuit, last time Merit Systems Protection Board lacked a quorum for 5 years, said you couldn't move to federal court. We'll see if that changes. But right now, you're likely to get stuck. But to retain your rights to challenge, you still need to file within 30 days. And that's really important to know. I'd recommend if you're thinking of challenging the RIF, Kevin mentioned that there are a bunch of organizations that are forming to provide pro bono legal services. One is called Rise Up. The website is workerslegaldefense.org. That one's put together by Democracy Forward, AFL-CIO, and a bunch of other organizations. They are providing pro bono help. They also have a bunch of resources on their website for how to prepare for a RIF and what to do if you are RIFed. But that's kind of what's going to happen if you decide to challenge the RIF.
Yeah. And so in connection with that, the question I've seen a couple of times in our Q&A is, are you familiar with the San Francisco District Court case? And that is, for those who are not familiar with it, it's conducting large-scale layoffs in conjunction with the reorganization of federal civilian agencies. Can either of you all speak briefly about what you are aware of, and then how that may inform people's decisions going forward?
So if I'm going to start, because
Yes.
I'll need Nick to back clean up because Kevin, this might be a good time for you to turn your head. I'm reading all these comments too, and I'm just trying to be very politically correct, but I have to be blunt. Nothing that has happened since January 20th has made any sense, follows any legal precedent, or is something that we have seen before. So if you're looking to make rational sense out of things that are completely illegal and irrational, stop it. Stop wasting your brain power. Stop getting wrapped around the axle. None of this makes sense. None of it is following acceptable norms of behavior, basic personnel law and rules, and frankly, none of it's being done by career civil servants. Because if y'all haven't figured it out yet, HR was not at the table for much of this work. This was being directed by people with no federal HR experience. I'm sorry if that's a shock to some of you. I would suggest you read the room, as it says. None of this makes sense. So I hope what Nick and I are able to bring is at least a little bit of clarity on what you should be focused on, i.e. getting your personnel records in file. So whenever you make decisions that you're going to have to make for yourself, because there's a lot of questions in there too about, should I take, I'm on DRPs, should I just stay on it and let them riff you? Those are decisions you have to make for yourself. I am not going to give you any guidance. I am going to tell you that if you think court injunctions, and yes, there have been some of them stopping RIFs, I would invite you to look at what happened when there were court injunctions to reinstate probationary employees and what the response was to that. Right now, there is no one in any branch of government fighting to have a nonpartisan civil service. So that's why I'm so grateful all of you are making time for this tonight. You're probably angry because you were hoping to get some clarity and some direction, but that's the entire intent of what's been happening. It is what is going on right now is intended to destroy the civil servants from the inside out so the positions can be occupied by partisan appointees. There is no other way to sugarcoat it. You need to focus on your records and you need to decide what you can bear in terms of working in a environment that's very uncertain, that probably has a lot of stress. You're probably not getting a lot of clarity or clear information, and that can be really detrimental to mental health and to physical health. So you have to weigh instead. I also see a lot of questions about, well, you're not answering our questions about retention registers. Nick is telling you in no uncertain terms, he's an attorney. I'm an HR person. None of this is a secret. There have to be retention registers. So if they're telling you they don't have retention registers, they're either admitting they did not follow the rules and do it correctly, or they're lying and refusing to share the information. So save those emails. That's all I can really tell you. Some of this is not rocket science from the perspective of here's the map on how to do things. And the things that you are seeing and witnessing now, and I don't care what agency you work at, they're wrong. They are not following the rules, and they have not been since January 20th.
And then kind of connecting with you, Nick, what Traci just shared is in your article that you wrote in the 2024 Lawfare Primary, you noted that the Trump administration has always viewed civil servants as an obstacle rather than a partner in governing. How might this perspective be informing recent changes, and what is your advice to civil servants?
Yeah, so connecting completely with what Traci said into why this doesn't make sense. The goal of the Trump administration, no matter what the rhetoric is, right, is not to reduce the size of the federal, well, it is, but it's not to meaningfully make government more efficient. It's not to find waste, fraud, and abuse to whatever extent that may exist. It is to punish civil servants because they perceive the federal workforce as resistant to its agenda. Now, let me just say empirically, there is very, very little evidence that federal civil servants ever resist the president's agenda. For the vast majority of federal civil servants, they are public servants who are motivated to help government function, and they do that regardless of who is in office. Yes, there are some high-profile cases of resistance, but whatever story the Trump administration is telling is an inaccurate one with respect to that. So how is that motivating what they're doing, though, right? Because they do perceive that federal civil servants are resistant to what they want to accomplish, and that is shaping how they are behaving. So one way that they've sought to reduce the size of the federal workforce or reduce the perception of resistance is just try to reduce the size of the federal workforce, remove as many people as they perceive as obstacles in their way. So this explains the introduction of things like deferred resignation, the widespread use of RIFs, and the arbitrary firing of probationary employees. Okay. Also helps to explain the toxic environment that a lot of people are reporting in their agencies and among political appointees. Director of OMB, Russell Vought, said it was his goal to traumatize federal employees. They're doing a very, very good job of doing that by making everyone's life miserable. So their hope is not to make the workforce more efficient or make government more efficient. Their hope is to remove as many employees, voluntarily or involuntary, as possible. Another thing going on here is the president has an incentive and a belief that he has a right to control all federal civil servants. So you may see in the news or op-eds or on Lawfare, where I write a fair amount, discussions of unitary executive theory. So unitary executive theory is this theory of constitutional law grounded in Article 2, because Article 2 says that the executive power is vested in the president. And it doesn't specify anyone else. If you read the Constitution, you don't see agencies mentioned and you don't see civil servants mentioned. And so there's this theory of law that the president has to be the one to control all executive power and therefore has to control everyone who exercises that executive power. And so some of what we're seeing is what Traci is talking about, where they want to replace civil servants with political appointees who are going to do the president's bidding. So we saw Scheduled Policy Career, which was called Schedule F, and frankly, Scheduled Policy Career is a far worse name, but Schedule F has been reinstated. The goal of that is to make it easier to remove federal employees and replace them with individuals who are going to be more politically loyal. I suspect we will see arguments in the courts very soon that the tenure protections offered by the civil service are unconstitutional. And so this whole idea that the civil service and its employees are contrary to President Trump's agenda is motivating all of these personnel changes. Mm-hmm. So how can federal employees, what advice do I have for them? The first is be really knowledgeable, protect yourself, download your records, document everything. Like as an attorney, the one thing I can tell you is download your records and document everything. As Traci said, at the end of the day, you have to make a choice about what's best for you. I cannot tell you whether VSIP or VERA or DRP is the right choice or whether you should stick it out. I also can't tell you whether you have a valid case before the Merit Systems Protection Board or whether the Merit Systems Protection Board will have a quorum by the time your case gets appealed. Those are decisions you're going to have to weigh and think about for yourself. The other thing I'll say, though, kind of going off of something Traci ended with, was Washington Post had this really well-written but incredibly depressing article on the mental health crisis facing federal employees. Frankly, there's a bunch of studies showing that unemployment is as traumatic to an individual as a divorce or being cheated on. Protect yourself and really make sure you're talking to others about how you're coping with this. If you find that you're becoming depressed, suicidal, anything like that, please get mental health. It's very important for you and your ability to think through and process this moment that you really get the help you need to kind of cope with everything that's going on, because I think it's traumatic for a lot of people, and you know, you need to recognize that and deal with it as though it is a mental health problem.
And thank you so much for that advice, Nick, because I think sometimes we feel we have to push through this and just get through this, and sometimes it might take longer than we think. But one of the things you did mention and you touched on in your comments is around reassignments and relocations. That's one way in which this administration and previous administrations have enabled voluntary separations. So Traci, can you talk about who can be reassigned and how does that process work?
This is a perfect segue. And first, I do want to also thank Nick. That's That's one of the things I know I'm very emphatic about, and actually it feeds into the next section. The bottom line is the agency has the upper hand. The agency can decide when it needs to run a RIF. The agency can decide when to reassign someone, and a directed reassignment is always permissible as long as it's not done on what we would call protected status. You know, they can't reassign you based on your race or your age or your gender or your sexual identification, none of that. And the other thing is you can be relocated. Now, if you're going to be relocated, the government does have responsibilities it must fulfill, such as paying for said relocation. And that's also where the piece of notifying Congress tends to come into play, because those relocation packages, they're also dollar signs, right? Nothing comes without a price tag. That's why the impact of what has happened these first 5 months, the financial impact will not be calculated for at least another year. And I'm not sure if we can ever calculate the impact it has had on recruiting a future federal workforce, on retaining people that a year from now might hit their breaking point and decide they're going to go, all the institutional knowledge that's walked out the door. So the way to make this, I think, more palpable, and I did see a lot of comments where people were angry that we're not talking about, I guess, what they were expecting to talk about. At the end of the day, these are rules and regulations that the government has these in their toolkit. What we are debating, and well, actually, we're not debating anything. We're trying to give you information to help you. Because if you want to waste your time wondering how you can challenge if work is truly going away or reassign, I'm going to tell you right now, don't bother. That is not for you to argue, because the agency, and Nick, I believe, alluded to this, they're going to have to make their arguments, whether it be to Congress or the courts, or at least have it on record of why they went down this path. And it's not a very high bar they have to meet. They just have to show that they put some thought into it and show what they're going to do to still enable the mission. So full stop right there. Don't waste your time thinking about how am I going to challenge this RIF? It's unconstitutional. It's not. Full stop. Realignments happen all the time. If you don't know someone that's worked for DOD, I urge you to make a friend, because DOD does this like clockwork. That's why the DOD RIF tool is being used by OPM. They have done things also like base realignments and closures. They are very well skilled in doing this because it's always been a part of their fabric. For the non-military civilian agencies and non-security civil service agencies, it's not as routine, which is also why I think there is this culture shock and fear going on, because not only is it something that's not been done often, right now it's not even being done correctly. So just know an agency can always run a RIF, they can always reassign work and reassign people, and they can always relocate people, especially if any of you on the line are with the senior executive service. You signed a mobility agreement. So there's no expectation that you will be limited to one job, nor will you have one job forever. So with that, I think now it's a good time. See, Nick and I have become BFFs, and it's only been a week, but he is true embodiment that people from Minnesota are nice because they can put up with craziness, just like right here. Nick's going to talk about some of the procedural points, and I highlighted already, full stop, HR, you can be reassigned at any level. I don't care if you're bargaining unit or non-bargaining unit. You don't have the right to have your specific job forever, but we can arm you with the information about the policies, regulations, and steps that need to be followed to make sure you understand your rights. So Nick, do you want to add a little bit of sanity to that hot mess?
Yeah, I'll add two things really quick. One is on the constitutional point about RIFs, which is I want to emphasize RIFs are permitted under Title V, and there are a bunch of OMB or OPM regulations implementing what is ultimately a very scarce provision of Title V, but explaining what this process has to look like. On the constitutional side, there are some court cases you are going to start hearing about that have started to push back against RIFs on separation of powers grounds. Those are arguments that are not going to be available to federal employees. They are the types of arguments that have to be raised by larger institutions like nonprofits and states. That is what is happening in the California case. Now, the way that is proceeded, legal scholars are not clear whether that argument is right. We are not certain it would hold up at the Supreme Court when it inevitably gets to the Supreme Court. So there is a lot of case law developing very, very quickly. Usually, these sort of issues are never before federal district courts. They are very rarely before federal circuit courts that are not the federal circuit, because as Traci said, it is very rare that civilian agencies experience RIFs, and we have never seen something like this before. So you have a lot of judges learning about the civil service laws very, very quickly, and it is going to take several years for all of these cases to shake out and see what happens with this process. So I am aware of the California case. I am secretly rooting for the California case, but I can't say that that California case is going to up or stay and be the law at the end of the day. There's a lot of uncertainty with this. I'll touch on one thing with respect to reassignments, and that's what happens after a RIF. It's bumping and retreating. So I told you that one of the challenges that is most frequently brought when an individual experiences a RIF is reassignment. So if you are in the retention register and someone in a different competitive level has a position for which you are qualified and you are knocked out of your competitive level, you're often able to be reassigned to that position if you are higher in the full register than they are. That requires a lot of knowing where you should fall in the register. Traci is absolutely right. If you are being told there are not retention registers, that is wrong. Well, there might not be retention registers. That is an error.
Right.
Or there are retention registers, you're entitled to them, and their failure to provide them to you is unlawful. So you need to figure out which of those two worlds you're in.
Right.
But the answer is get an attorney. So that bumping and retreating process, though, is really one of the most successful challenges we see with RIFs. It is the most likely to succeed. Usually, when these RIFs happen, the personnel records are accurate and the order of retention is usually accurate. It's often that reassignment process that we see challenges that succeed, because you can assert that I am qualified for this position the agency otherwise doesn't think I'm qualified for. And so you want to be cognizant of that there may be a different position you would be eligible for, even though you are being told you cannot keep your current position.
Right. And if that's actually a good segue, there are other components that go into deciding that register. Your veteran's preference will come into play. Your years of service come into play in what's considered a bona fide appointment. There are certain exemptions. So if anyone's on the line is in a time-bound appointment, say you're in a term position, well, that factors into your also possibility or eligibility for severance pay. But that's again, getting back to what Nick and I are trying to impress upon everyone. There are rules and policies and procedures that dictate every phase of this. So it is not just a wholesale. That's why one of the things that I am pretty confident, I'm telling you right now on the record, and I know this is recorded, I am not speaking for the government. I'm not speaking for any agency. I'm speaking as an American citizen who had 21 plus years in his federal service, most of that doing higher level HR work. This is something that is unprecedented. So if we were living in normal times, we would have the time to do all these steps thoroughly and completely and correctly. But if you recall back in February, that's when the RIF word started really getting a lot of traction. And people were saying, we will do this RIF in 60 days. And I can tell you every HR person that's worth their salt knew that that was a bogus claim, because that is not what the outline of the time frame is, and there is work behind the scenes that needs to happen. The other thing I will mention, and this gets to Nick's point, and it's important, just because you may believe someone's not qualified for a job doesn't mean that you have all of the answers. It still is a personnel action, and at the end of the day, management has that say. Now, there could be a process in place to challenge it, again, if that's exercised in your contracts particularly, but we're also dealing in an environment where the labor union contracts are not being honored as they are supposed to be. So it's just to make sure that you have all the information at hand. There are certainly things that I also agree with so many of these comments on how things should be playing out. That is not the world we're dealing in right now. So hopefully you all have some other avenues. And if I could just quickly also mention there's a lot of people from HHS here. I'm going to shout out to all of you too. You guys are going through a lot. Again, there should be retention registers. Maybe if they hadn't riffed all the good HR people at HHS by this point, you'd have them. But secondly is they're making these things up as they go along as well. So you have to understand all this pivot back and forth. That's because when they're getting caught with something they know is not legally sufficient or will be struck down, there's a quick pivoting going on. So for those of you that are asking questions about, I have a June 2nd RIF date, what do? I don't know. Your agency should be giving you clear direction. And I would urge you to put those questions in writing to save for your record, and also possibly contact your elected member of Congress, because congressional leadership don't want to see a lot of feds in their districts losing their jobs.
So we're almost at time. So thank you all so much for the insights you've shared thus far. And I just want to collect one more snippet or insight that you would like to share with the group. So let's start with Nick. Any last words, recommendations, words of encouragement, any other insights you would like to share with this group around RIFs, reassignments, or relocations?
So in terms of words of encouragement, let me say the following, which is, I studied the federal workforce. I haven't been a federal employee in about 10 years, and I worked in the judicial branch, so I didn't work in the executive branch. But one thing I will say is that I am honored to live in a country where I have interacted with many of you, maybe not you particularly, but thousands of federal employees since the start. And the number of you who just want to continue to serve the public is very heartening. I know people who have not taken VERA or DRP or VSIPs simply because you value the role you play in government. And I want to thank you all for your dedication to, providing us good quality work, and that you are not deserving of what is happening to you
Not at all.
right now. So that's one. Two is just the last thing we have said over and over again. Okay. This is very hard. It is very complicated. This is a situation we haven't seen before, which is why there are not a lot of resources out there. And so it's important that you document as much as possible, and you get in contact with a group like Rise Up or with your union as soon as something happens. Because there are a lot of class actions happening right now. There are a lot of big movements that you might be able to join that you otherwise wouldn't be able to join if you didn't act as quickly. So just be cognizant of that and really do all you can to protect yourself in case something happens, and hold the government accountable to those procedures Traci and I are talking about. Yes, the government has a right to go through RIFs. At the same time, it only has the right to use RIFs to the extent it follows the procedures in law, and you play the role in holding the government accountable to ensure those procedures are followed.
I want to just echo Nick's thanks. It is not for the faint of heart to be in the civil service right now. And I hope that especially my comments did not come across as too harsh, but I think that when you live in the insanity for 5 months, it's very easy to focus on things that are outside of your control. And you should use your limited energy and and think of your mental health, as Nick articulated earlier, which was excellent, and not waste your time on things you cannot control. Another random question that came in, just to give you context, because it's excellent, is someone asked me, how do we know what the numbers are that an agency needs to reduce by? And again, that would be part of RIF 101 when you're doing your workforce planning, which is something that all HR shops do. When they are brought to the table to be a part of the conversation, they could provide that information. That did not happen. So it's very hard to answer your questions directly without knowing what your individual agency's intent is, where they want to cut, what the actual numbers are. Because if there was an actual number being thrown around in a specific agency, I guarantee your HR team could tell leadership how to get there legally. and to ensure that it was done in a way that would not be overturned by the courts or MSPB or FLRA or OSC. The bottom line is none of this that's going on right now is rational. So hopefully what Nick and I shared with you at least gives you an idea of whether or not you're on the right track, and you need to pay attention to what you can tolerate. So if you haven't joined Rise Up, or you haven't looked at the Civil Service Strong website, or you haven't tapped into your labor unions or federal manager associations or SEA, now's a good time to do so, just so you at least stay connected. And that's the information that you should be able to rely on as being fair and accurate and up to date. And I wouldn't really trust anything else. But there's also, I'd be remiss if I didn't shout out the partnership's own website. They have a whole toolkit for feds that is run by some far smarter people than me. And they are doing a very good job getting that just-in-time information out there. So please make sure you visit that as well.
Thank you, Traci, for the segue. And so with that, thank you so much for you all's insights, sharing your expertise and your time, because we know that you all have a lot of commitment. And thank you so much for sharing your time with our audience. To Traci's last point, please do visit our FedSupport Hub. We do have our RIF FAQ on there. So some of the questions that we were not able to get to, some of those questions are actually answered in that FAQ. In addition, we also do have our RIF quick reference guide, which is also in the chat itself. So please do scroll up in the chat, but also do visit our FedSupport website. But before I wrap up, I do want to do one more poll. So as you all know, this is a series of webinars. This is just one of many that we've done already, and we do have others in mind. So with that, we would like to take another opportunity to collect information from you all for what your needs are and how can we meet those needs. So with that, we have a quick poll. Again, this is an optional poll. There's 3 quick questions. So the first question asked about how effective you feel this webinar has been. The second is about how much you agree that you will take information from this webinar and apply it moving forward. And the last question asked for your input on future webinar topics. So do please take a couple of moments to fill that out to inform our future webinars. So again, I'll be quiet for a couple of minutes, for about a minute, and then wrap up today. All right. Thank you all so much. Mary, you can close it. Again, for you all who have been in attendance, thank you all so much again for the feds who are here. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your continuous commitment to not only our safety, but also your own. So again, as I love Nick's poignant point was, please do take care of your mental health. Again, we know that you are so dedicated to us and our safety, but please do take care of yourself. With that, again, I have to plug our FedSupport Hub. Please do find that resource out there. It not only contains information for what you're going through now, but also things to think about for the future. And then again, one last thank you to Nick and Traci for your time, your expertise, and also your service to the American public. So good night to you all. Thank you all so much. And please do tune into our future webinars.